A lot of people are under the misimpression that the Islamic Dilemma is some like clever modern argument cooked up by Christian apologists on YouTube or in recent debates. What if I told you we have new evidence of a Syriac Christian in the 700s, barely a century after Muhammad? He was already making this exact same argument. That's right, we've uncovered a manuscript where George of Beltan, a patriarch writing in the 8th century, lays out a response to Islam so sharp, so devastating that honestly it makes us look like amateurs. And I'm not exaggerating here, Beltan might have been a better apologist than we are today. In this video, we're going to dive deep into this forgotten text that was actually just recently translated for the first time, see how he dismantled the Muslim claim of tahrif, or corruption of the scriptures, and show how he basically invented the Islamic Dilemma before it ever had a name. Now, stick around because by the end of this video, you're going to see how George absolutely dismantles Islam's claims to truth before it even got off the ground, guys. And trust me, once you see how good his case is, you're never going to look at the Islamic Dilemma the same way again. But first, let's set the stage here, okay? The Islamic Dilemma, it might sound fancy, but it's actually really simple. All right, the Quran repeatedly points Muslims back to the scriptures that came before it, the Torah and the Gospel. You see this in places like Surah 5:43-48 and Surah 10:94 and other verses. But here's the problem, okay? Those previous scriptures, very obviously, flat out contradict the Quran. And there are only really two options, and neither of them work, all right? Horn number one. If the scriptures before Muhammad were reliable, as the Quran itself implies, then Islam collapses because those same scriptures contradict Islamic teaching on almost every core issue. The Old Testament prophets, the Trinity, the crucifixion, the deity of Christ, you name it, it contradicts it. Horn number two, if those scriptures were unreliable, if they'd been corrupt or lost, then the Quran undercuts itself. Why? Well, because it tells Muslims, and even Muhammad himself in Surah 10:94, to consult the Jews and the Christians that were reading the previous scriptures. That makes absolutely zero sense if the scriptures were already unreliable. So either way, the Quran is stuck on the horns of a dilemma. If it affirms the Bible, Islam is false. But if it rejects the Bible, Islam is actually incoherent. That's the power of this argument. It's not some little gotcha trick. It's actually showing that Islam, by its own standard, defeats itself. Our Muslim apologist friends will tell us that this is a clever new apologetic trick that we cooked up in recent debates, right? It's not something that goes back to the early Christian history, the Christians that were engaging with Islam. But George of Beltan, writing just a century after Muhammad, was already seeing this exact tension. And that's what makes his work actually really explosive. To appreciate how explosive George of Beltan's argument is, you need to understand when and where he was writing. We're not talking about some medieval monk tucked away in the 1200s. George lived in the 8th century, barely 100 years after Muhammad. That means he wasn't working with centuries of hindsight. He was looking Islam straight in the face while it was still in its early rise. George was the West Syriac Patriarch from 758 to 789, which makes him one of the highest ranking Christian leaders in the Middle East. And his life was anything but calm. He was actually imprisoned in Baghdad by the Caliph for 9 years on charges of tax fraud and refusing to honor Muhammad's name. When he was finally released, he didn't retire quietly. He went straight back to defending the faith. Now here's why his story matters. Okay, Syriac Christians like George were on the front lines. They were the ones who first had to wrestle with Islam's claims. They heard Muslim accusations about the Bible being corrupted, what's called tahrif, not as abstract theories, but as live, pressing challenges threatening their communities. So when George sat down to write his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, that's our focus today, tucked inside is this little chapter where he fires back at Islam. And it's in that chapter where we find the earliest fully developed response to tahrif. What's more, the way he responds isn't just some generic defense of scripture. It's the skeleton of the very argument we now call the Islamic Dilemma. This is what makes George's voice so uniquely powerful. He wasn't, a YouTuber in modern day times trying to get clicks. He was a pastor, a patriarch, and honestly a prisoner for Christ, fighting to preserve the truth of the gospel in the very century after Islam's birth. Before we jump into the actual manuscript of George's argument, I want to pause for just a second. If you believe that this kind of work that I'm doing here matters, taking esoteric scholarship and turning it into accessible apologetics, then consider supporting me on Patreon. It's linked right in the description for you guys. Your support literally makes it possible for me to do this deep research, to translate jargony material into plain English, and get discoveries like this out to the wider church. I can only do what I do with your help. Okay, now let's get to the fun part. Here's the actual discovery, and trust me, it's definitely worth the wait. So first, where did scholars actually find George's proto-Islamic dilemma? Well, it wasn't in some standalone book against Islam. George didn't sit down to write an anti-Muslim treatise. Instead, it's tucked away right inside his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, specifically in the introduction of chapter 49. And that detail is actually crucial. George wasn't out to score debate points. He was trying to establish the reliability of the gospel for his Christian readers. He's explaining why they can trust the scriptures even when Muslims accuse them of corruption. That's the sort of pastoral heart of this whole thing, defending the truth of the gospel at a time when his people were under enormous pressure to abandon it. The only surviving copy of this commentary is Vatican Syriac 154. It's a battered manuscript copied partly on parchment from the 8th to 10th centuries and partly on paper from the 13th. You can actually access it directly on the Vatican website. You guys can see it on the screen here. It's sort of incomplete, it's damaged and scattered, but thankfully enough of it survived for our purposes today. For centuries, this text sat sort of unnoticed in the Vatican Library until modern scholarship finally brought it to light. Bert Jacobs recently published the Editio Precepts of chapter 49, giving us our first full translation of George's words. I've got his paper linked in the description if you guys want to go check it out. But now what George argues there is actually extraordinary. This chapter is titled Against the Pagans Concerning the Truth of the Gospel. But make no mistake, the pagans in view are Muslims. George never names Muhammad or the Quran directly. Early apologists often avoided that for safety reasons, but he does make it pretty obvious. He talks about the time before the coming of their prophet and even quotes or paraphrases the Quran. The issue that he's addressing is the accusation of Tarif, a Muslim doctrine that Christians sort of corrupted their Bibles. Faced with claims that the Quran is false because it contradicts the Jewish and Christian scriptures, later Muslim commentators argued that the Christians had corrupted their scriptures and included false material. By George's day, this accusation was already circulating, and Christians in the area had to respond to it. Before I break down George's arguments, I'm going to put up on the screen the full English translation of George's commentary so that you guys can read it for yourself. Feel free to pause the video and read through his comments. It's not very long, or as I mentioned, you can just click the link in the description to the full paper. All right, here we go. George opens with a brilliant rhetorical move. Pay attention here, okay? He says the way to answer the charge of corruption is to ask 4 questions. When, who, why, and what? In other words, if you're going to claim that the gospel was falsified or corrupted, tell us, when did this happen? Who carried it out? Why would they do it? And what exactly was changed? It's super simple, but it's also really devastating to this doctrine, and it anticipates the entire later history of Christian responses to Tarif. Let's break this down because this is all very relevant for us today. Okay, first, George presses the when question of timing. If the gospel was corrupted before Muhammad, then, he points out, why would Surah 1094 instruct Muhammad to ask the Jews and Christians about it? Here's exactly what he says. So at which time, I ask again, who, why, and which words? If they should say that it happened before the coming of their prophet, see, he said that it was spoken to him that he should come to those who hold the scriptures to find the truth. For he said, quote, O those who hold the scriptures, confirm the things which we have brought to you in words. And, quote, if you are doubtful, ask those who have been holding the scriptures before you. See, he sends you to us. He's quoting Surah 1094. George knew, even in the 700s, that the Quran itself in Surah 1094 assumes the reliability of earlier scriptures. But if, on the other hand, the corruption supposedly happened after Muhammad, George says that's actually impossible. Why? because the gospel was already spread across the world in different languages. He puts it really bluntly, and these are his own words. And after his coming, there is no proof whatsoever of a synod of all nations in which Greeks, Arabs, Persians, barbarians, and Syrians were gathered, during which they determined which words they would omit and which words they would add. This is because the gospel is the same to all of them. Next, he pushes the what and why question of motive. Suppose the Christians sort of changed certain parts of the Bible. Why would Christians falsify their own scriptures? George points out it's not for the money, since the gospel still commands poverty, not for spiritual advantage, since, quote, spiritual gain cannot be attained by consciously spreading false ideas about God. He even turns this into a subtle jab at Islam, hinting that they're the ones who used material gain to attract followers. Then, in addressing the who question, George brilliantly appeals to the Quran's own teaching about the apostles of Jesus. It couldn't have been them, since the Quran itself in various places calls them divinely chosen and faithful. If that's the case, George asks, how could they possibly have transmitted corrupted accounts from their master? This is a proto-dilemma move, using Islam's own scripture to shore up the authority of the gospel. So again, George's words and advice are still relevant for us today. The next time a Muslim tells you that the Bible has been corrupted, follow George's examples and ask 4 questions. When, who, why, and what? But in his commentary, George doesn't stop there. After dismantling the corruption charge with his famous when, who, why, what questions, he takes the debate one step further. He pivots to a positive case for gospel reliability. In other words, he doesn't just play defense. He builds a constructive argument for why the gospel must be true. And you guys really need to pay attention here, because this move that he makes here, this argument he builds out, is brilliant and arguably something that Christian apologists need to be doing a lot more of in the context of the Islamic dilemma. In his commentary, George lays out 5 criteria that prove gospel reliability. First, the gospel's teaching is sound because it transcends earthly lusts. Second, its commandments heal the soul's infirmities. Third, it foretells future events with prophetic clarity. Fourth, it spread to all nations not by political power, wealth, polished rhetoric, or manipulative tactics, but by a message so lofty it looked like folly to the world. And then fifth, it is confirmed by the testimony of the scriptures themselves. Just think about how clever this actually is. These criteria aren't arbitrary. He didn't just pick these out of thin air, right? They actually make a lot of sense. A true revelation from God should actually elevate us above our base desires. It should bring healing. It should reveal what is to come, spread without worldly bribery, and harmonize with earlier revelation. George is doing in the 700s what most Christians today can't do: lay down a rational framework for why Christianity is true. And remarkably, his argument holds up pretty well. Scholars call this the true religion apology, and in George's hands, it's one of the earliest examples that we actually have. So here's the big picture. Okay, George of Beltan dismantled the charge of Tarif through asking his 4 questions and citing the Quran itself to answer them. Then he went further. He made a positive case for gospel reliability. Here's the crucial point. Pay attention to this. Once you grant the gospel's reliability, the Islamic dilemma writes itself. If the gospels are reliable, Islam is false because the Quran contradicts the gospels. If the gospels are unreliable, Islam is false because the Quran itself implies that the gospels are reliable in Surah 1094. George nailed it 1200 years ago from a prison cell in a commentary on Matthew, trying to strengthen the faith of his people. He handed us one of the earliest versions of the Islamic dilemma. Why does all of this matter? You might be thinking, like, why should we care what a Syriac Patriarch in the late 700s, why should we care that he was already making this argument? Well, here's why. It shows us that the doctrine of Tarif, the idea that the Jews and Christians corrupted their scriptures, didn't appear in a vacuum. It was a reaction. Muslims were confronted with the uncomfortable fact that the Quran flatly contradicted the Bible. And then, when Christians pointed that out, Muslims needed some sort of escape hatch. They needed to respond to it, and that's where Tarif came in. George of Beltan, again, just 100 years after Muhammad, showed Christians exactly how to respond. Not just by saying, we didn't corrupt our scriptures, but by flipping the charge back on Islam itself. This discovery also blows up a very common objection we're hearing today, that the Islamic Dilemma is just a cheap apologetic trick cooked up by Western apologists on YouTube. No, that's not the case at all. The evidence actually shows that Christians in the 8th century were already spotting this very same problem. And they didn't just spot it, they built apologetic defenses for their people around it. And also it strengthens the credibility of the dilemma itself, because when an argument emerges naturally out of history, when it's not invented by a bunch of YouTubers, but discovered actually in the first encounters between Christians and Muslims, that's actually evidentially powerful. It shows us that this isn't us forcing something onto the Quran. It's actually us recognizing what Christians have always recognized. Islam is self-defeating on its own terms. Now, at this point, some people might object. They might say, well, hold on, George of Beltan wasn't actually making the Islamic dilemma. He was just arguing against corruption of the gospel. Now, I thought a lot about this objection, but here's the thing. He was doing a lot more than just that. Okay, after giving his positive criteria for gospel reliability, he ends his chapter with this declaration, quote, "Therefore, every book in which all these things are collected is the perfect and complete truth." He's referring to the 5 criteria for gospel reliability. And everything that is lacking from them is either entirely false or imperfect. That's not merely like a, hey guys, don't worry about this, our texts are fine statement. That's George going a lot further. He's affirming the gospel accounts as the full truth and drawing a line in the sand. If the gospels are true and Tarif is false, then the Quran, which contradicts them, cannot stand. In other words, George supplies the bones of the Islamic dilemma. The Quran appeals to the Gospels as authoritative, but their truth puts Islam on a collision course with itself. And also remember, we don't have all of George's works. It's entirely possible that he made this conclusion explicit elsewhere in his other writings. But what we do have is certainly enough. He already gave us everything we need to reach that conclusion. Another objection goes, well, in Surah 1094, the previous scriptures in view are only the stories of the prophets. I actually made an entire video response to this objection, which I've got linked in the description. You guys can go watch it if you're interested. In short, this objection doesn't work because those stories of the prophets also contradict the Quran, so it doesn't help. Another common objection is, well, corruption solves the problem. The Bible was altered, but George dismantled that literally 12 centuries ago. Okay, if corruption happened before Muhammad, then, as George points out beautifully, and perfectly in line with the Islamic dilemma, Surah 1094 absolutely makes no sense if corruption happened before Muhammad. If corruption had happened after Muhammad, that's actually impossible because no universal synod of Greeks, Arabs, Persians, and Syrians ever got together to rewrite the gospel. As George puts it, since the rise of Islam, no synod has taken place in which the nations decided to alter the gospel because it is the same to all of them. That leaves us, the only possible alternative here is what I like to call the selective corruption hypothesis, or selective tarif, that just the wrong parts of the Bible were corrupted, the rest are reliable. That falls apart too, guys. Okay, I also addressed this claim in the previous video that I mentioned, linked in the description, but in short, this hypothesis doesn't work because, one, it's completely unevidenced. There's no historical proof that the Bible was selectively altered in just the right places that line up with the Quran. Two, it's completely unfalsifiable. Any verse that contradicts the Quran can just be waved away as corrupt. And then three, this is a circular argument. It assumes the Quran is accurate in order to defend the Quran. That's not an argument. That's a rational dead end. So the objections don't work. George's argument still stands, and in some ways he said it sharper than we do today. Now, we've covered a lot of ground, so let me just boil all this down, right? Here's what you need to remember from this video. George of Beltan, writing in the 700s, just a century after Muhammad, was already dismantling the charge of Tarif, and in the process, sketching out the bones of what we now call the Islamic dilemma. In challenging Tarif, he asked absolutely killer questions that we still need to be asking today. When was the gospel corrupted? Who did it? Why would they do it? And what exactly was changed? No Muslim could answer them then, and no Muslim can answer them now. He showed that corruption couldn't have happened before Muhammad because Surah 1094 assumes the scriptures are reliable. It couldn't have happened after Muhammad because no worldwide synod ever met to change the text. And the apostles themselves, according to the Quran, were divinely chosen. So how could they possibly have transmitted falsehood? That's the heart of George's case. Okay, if the Gospels are reliable, Islam collapses because it contradicts them. If the Gospels are unreliable, the Quran undercuts itself, as we see in Surah 1094. Either way, the Quran is checkmated by its own standard. And that's what makes this discovery so incredible. The Islamic dilemma isn't some like clever modern trick. Christians in the 700s already saw it, already argued it, and already used it to defend the gospel. So here's my challenge to you. Memorize Surah 1094. Learn George's simple for, when, who, why, what questions and use them. This isn't just history. It's an argument Christians have been making for over 1,000 years, and it still stands today. If you want more groundbreaking discoveries like this, hit subscribe because we're literally just getting started. Oh, and by the way, Christianity is true.